Great, thank you. All right, now we are moving on to Montana Library Federation's history and evaluation, and Tracy Cook. Hi, Tracy.
Hey, how's it going? Hope the commissioners are doing okay. It's a lot of information for you. Jenny asked me to give a presentation to you about federations. And so I'm going to share my screen here. Just a few moments. All right. So what Jenny asked me to do was share with the commission kind of the history of federations. And the reason for this, as I said in the memo, was just kind of a recognition there have been questions from commissioners and also from coordinators and from librarians kind of about library federations. And that prompted us to think, is it time to maybe do a review of the structure? That is something that has happened in the past with federations, so it's not a new concept by any means. The title of this, A Time for Great Things, actually comes from a publication from the State Library that was produced in the 1960s, and it was about federations and the concept and purpose behind them. So what I'm going to talk about today is just kind of a real quick reminder of what federations are, because I know for you new commissioners, you get so much information thrown at you. So I wanted to take a few moments to kind of just refresh your memory about federations. I wanted to talk a bit about the legislative intent and the history of federations, and then kind of ended with maybe a discussion about questions we might want to ask ourselves if we go forward with a review of the federations. You know, as always, feel free to stop me if you have a question or a comment. And then I also invited the Federation coordinators. I think some of them had to step away, but I invited them to certainly chime in as we were going through this. So this is a map of federations currently. It's a regional grouping of libraries. It's primarily public libraries that are participating in federations. The one exception is up in Golden Plains. The Tribal College Library at Fort Peck does participate in that federation. The federations are funded through coal severance tax, and that has been the case for many years now. They focus primarily on the 4 categories you see on the screen there. And those 4 categories have actually been around for quite a while. And you'll see them threaded throughout. I'm going to actually talk about some of the priorities that federations have had over time and how they've changed. So one of the things I did when I was trying to just kind of understand federations and their history was I looked at the legislation. And the legislature always has a policy statement when they add a section in the Montana Code. And this is the policy statement for federations. Kind of some of the key words in there is the regional idea, that there be regions within which libraries would come together, that they would pool resources and information, and they would avoid duplication of effort. And so I think one of the questions we need to ask ourselves is this intent still relevant? And then if it is relevant, is the current structure delivering that? So in the past, the State Library Commission has played a much more active role in federations. I mean, currently you might remember that we will bring to you their plan of service, which is basically how they intend to spend their money. And then we will also ask them to report back to you on how things have been going in the year. In the past, the commission actually would set goals for federations. They would work with the state librarian and the federation coordinators to kind of start these review processes where we would look at the structure of federations and see if they still made sense. And then the commission does have the job of setting boundaries for federations. And so the state library staff and the federation coordinators carry out your goals for us, for the federations. And then the library community is very much involved. I mean, as you saw when Hoffman York was kind of giving their presentation, One of the nice things about working for the state libraries, we work closely with the libraries around the state, and we would do the same in this situation. Many of these photos, by the way, are from the Montana Historical Society and just kind of historical documents that we had. So we have actually worked with federations since 1956. They came about because of two things, I would say. First, there was a movement for this idea of regional systems with a central library that would serve and provide library services that would supplement other libraries in the region. The federation concept was pretty attractive because it allowed local libraries to retain local control and yet benefit from centralized services. And then finally, the 1950s is when the Library Services Act came about, and that funding really encouraged collaboration. And that Library Services Act funding became Library Services and Construction Act, and then eventually Library Services and Technology Act, aka LSTA funding. One of the things I thought was really interesting when I was looking at the history of federations was this quote from Ruth Longsworth, who was the state librarian in the 1960s. And basically what she was saying is that prior to federations, people sort of believed that library services were just, you got what you got. And federations, to her, proved that by working together, you could actually provide high quality service for all Montanans. And I think it's good to remind ourselves of the why of federations and why they came about. When you look at federations in the past, there was very much a strong central library, and they had a lot more funding, which I'll talk about in a few moments. And that extra funding allowed them to really offer a lot of services that over time, because of budget cuts, those libraries could no longer offer. And the state library assumed some of them. And then the local libraries took on some of them. And so I think one of the things to consider is, are there services that maybe it makes sense to do regionally and would be very effective within the federation model, as well as kind of Bruce's question that he's asked over the years, what would you do if you had more funding? Now I would say federations are a lot more loose. They're much more like a network with the librarians working together rather than, there is no strong central library in a federation anymore. So this is a map that Matt from the GIS staff built for me. You know, the current federations have been around actually since the 80s. But that wasn't always the case. And so I asked him to build a map for me that showed the changes over time. And the Northwest Federation was the very first federation. Inez Herrig was the coordinator, and you'll see a picture of her later. But this animation shows you how the federations changed over time. The first federations received Library Services Act money and some local money. So libraries would literally pay a contract to get services from the central library. And the central library would provide things like reference, interlibrary loan, programming, and outreach. And so you can see how the boundaries are changing. You know, we think of all the counties as being in the current federation structure. However, it took time for them to actually begin to join the federation system. And so I kind of referenced this earlier with the federation funding. So in the late 70s, a pretty major piece of legislation came through that gave library federations 1% of coal severance tax monies, which that was $400,000 to $500,000. That's almost twice what they get right now. And that's in dollars from the 1970s, if you kind of think about purchasing power over time. What happened is that coal tax revenues dropped. And when that began to happen is when you saw that shift from a strong central or headquarters library providing staff support, providing reference and programming and all of that, to they had to eliminate some of those. And the state library began to take over some of those services for libraries in the state of Montana. And so the revenues began to drop. And this revenue, by the way, is for all 6 federations. And the revenue drops to what as far as I can determine, the lowest point was about $80,000 between the six federations. So as you can imagine, it drastically kind of changed federations and it drastically changed the services that they were able to offer. Slowly over time, we have been working back up until we are at our current place, which is awarding that $225,000 for the six federations. And so just a brief little history of the structure. That is Inez Herrig, by the way. That's courtesy of the Lincoln County Public Library. She was the director there and has the distinction of being the first Federation coordinator. From the 1950s until 2005, there was this concept of Federation Headquarters Library. And the state library would literally give the funding for that federation to the headquarters library, and then they would use the funds for a variety of purposes. And they would even, over time, give some of those funds to the individual libraries. As the revenue went down and things changed and more services moved from a regional concept to a statewide concept, the federation coordinators themselves began to say, you know, we're not sure that there's a need for a federation headquarters library, that it would actually be easier for the state library to give checks directly to the libraries, and that perhaps the only thing we really need is the federation coordinator who handles the logistics and so forth. And so a legislative change happened to kind of eliminate that headquarters library concept. However, as you can see, there is still a federation coordinator, and they have existed from the 1950s to today. And, you know, they handle the logistics, the planning, and the administration of the Federation. I would also say the coordinators find themselves in that leadership role, and they often give a lot of advice to the libraries as well. So priorities have changed over time. In the very beginning of the federations, individual library development was the priority. And then in the 1970s, the State Library Commission directed the coordinators and the federations to set goals to address the development and strengthening of library services and to tie those to the Montana Public Library standards. So it's interesting to see that individual library development was the priority at that point in time. It eventually shifted into what we begin to see today. And that is the resource sharing of materials, so interlibrary loan or bookmobiles. One of my interesting experiences I had as a consultant was being at a Golden Plains Library Federation meeting and meeting a board member who had been the bookmobile driver for the Golden Plains Federation. So at one point, all the federations had bookmobiles, and they would go out into the rural communities to provide these materials. In addition to sharing the materials, the commission directed federations to also share services. So there was actually discussion about having centralized ordering or having a resource center, AKA kind of a place that would provide reference, because of course these are pre-internet days. Then there was an emphasis on resource sharing of people. So the federations were the ones who provided consulting, as well as administration and public relations and programming. And then finally, the last priority is interesting to me. It's individual grants to libraries, which is now kind of the norm for federations. Most federation funding goes as an individual grant to a local library. In the 1990s, not surprisingly, you begin to see technology as a theme. There's an emphasis on getting internet in all libraries. There's also a reference to what was kind of a precursor to the current Montana Shared Catalog. And today, the priorities are the ones that I listed earlier, continuing education, resource sharing, technology, and programming. So that concept of sharing resources, whether it be materials or people, has sort of been threaded throughout the history of federations. So that's kind of just a real quick overview of what I learned in my history of federations. As we were working through this and considering some of the questions you've asked us and the coordinators have mentioned, I sort of started to try to capture them to get at this idea of if we were to do a review of the Library Federation structure, what would we want to know? And I mentioned some of these earlier, like is the legislative intent still relevant? Does the current structure meet the intent? The other things that I saw in past reviews that I think are important questions are these things of like, who is benefiting from the federation system and what is that benefit? What are the challenges facing federations? And then finally, are there services that make sense regionally versus statewide? And so I just was curious, first off, if you had any questions for me, and then if there are, I think there are a few coordinators that have been able to join us, opening it up to them to see what questions or comments they might have.
Tracy, thank you. What a great presentation. This really helped put some places, fill some gaps in my knowledge about the history of the federations. Terrific, thank you. Does anybody have any questions or comments for Tracy?
Tracy, I'm going to echo what Kenning said. Thank you so much. That was pretty historical, and you did a great job keeping me engaged. And thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. It was fun for me because I've been at the State Library long enough. I was seeing names that I recognized of people that I had worked with, and then also just people who were kind of legendary, like Inez Herrig.
With regard to your questions, I don't know if this answers any one of the questions in particular, but the common theme that I think I've heard from Federation coordinators every time they've given reports is that they are very dependent on the funding that comes to the federations, and they would really struggle without that funding.
And I reflect looking at these questions, which I think are excellent questions, that they're uniformly sort of supply side questions. What are we doing for the good of library services and content, as opposed to demand side. We're not asking in these questions about the benefits gained by Montana individuals or by Montana communities per se. We're asking about stuff and processes rather than the results of our work. I think that these are all questions that have to be discussed. I wonder if we would be well advised to include some of the individual. What are the effects on sufficiency in terms of content and services, with supplying things as on a statewide versus a regional, sub-regional versus a community versus a. I think that those might take us slightly different places in terms of how we think about the role of federations in providing each Montanan with sufficient library services.
Okay, no, that's a great point. How do Montanans benefit from federations? What do they get?
Yeah, and Tracy, I think even more specifically, how does this Montanan, I mean, not Montanans generally, but start breaking even finer subsets, and I think that might lead to different ways of looking at needs and resources and activities.
Kind of break it out by audience.
So I see a comment from Suzanne Raymer. It's a little cryptic. Suzanne, do you want to elaborate what you mean by why questions? Not hearing anything from Suzanne. Oh, she doesn't have a microphone plugged in. Okay. Do you mean, are you asking why there should be questions about this, or are you asking whether there should be questions that ask why?
I think it's the second, knowing Suzanne.
We do always ask why federations, why they exist. Yes, what is the current purpose and value? Yes, okay. And I think that maybe Tracy's third bullet there may cover some of that. So Tracy, are you, I'm not clear on whether you have decided to go ahead with this review or you are looking for, yes, the commission wants you to go ahead, or no? Are you looking for the commission to ask you to go ahead with this review?
You know, Jenny and I kind of talked about that. And we were definitely strongly leaning towards having the review, but I also wanted to be respectful of your role as a commission and your past history with federations to see if you would be interested in us continuing with that. If you did, I'd love to know if you have any specific goals and any expectations of us.
Yeah, what kind of resources would conducting a review take for you?
People time.
Yeah. How much people time?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. It's kind of probably like the Public Library Standards Task Force. We would bring the coordinators together, have a state library staff member, maybe even a couple of them. And then also I would say some librarians and some board members, because library board members play an active role in federations. And I know they have some thoughts on federations.
Mm-hmm.
And then it takes time of just kind of talking to the Montana library community and interpreting what they have to say and coming back with some kind of recommendation. Past reviews, I think almost every single one of them led to some kind of legislative change, which could happen. It may also lead to just a recommendation for more funding.
Well, I'd like to hear from the other commissioners, but I'm in favor of you doing this review. I mean, 17 years between reviews is a long time, and there's been an awful lot of change in the information environment in that time. So it seems like it is time to conduct another review. Other commissioners?
Well, many of us have sat through federation meetings and been part of them, and my experience has always been that the federations, the quality of interaction between librarians and library board members at federation meetings is different and in kind and good from other stuff that we've experienced. I've always, as I think Tracy suggested at the beginning of her comments, I've always wondered what would happen if we actually gave federations gas money, to actually do something. They do the services they do right now are important. They're the roles they play right now are important, but I wonder what they could do with some real resources to improve the quality of service and extend the reach of libraries in their area. And I believe that I think that there are great possibilities, and I think that federations are, even in light of changes in the information environment, I think they're really underutilized as a means of improving service to Montanans. And so, yeah, I think we should, if we do a review, I think we should, and we're looking at kind of recommendations, we should be looking at it again from how's this actually working for individuals, and let's think outside the box. Let's look at it from the user's point of view and figure out how we can use federations, and then give the federations the resources to really get the job that's needed to get done, to get that job done.
Okay. Sounds like Kristen is in favor of the review as well. Any other commissioners want to weigh in?
This is Peggy. I would weigh in favor of a review. I happened to speak to Toole County Librarian Heidi Alford and just asked her about her foundation background, and Tracy's smiling because she was very complimentary of you, Tracy, and of Jenny, and working with you in the Montana State Library. And her quote was, "I love my federation." So I think there's value there, and we need to see how we can extend it. So I'd greatly be in favor and would be interested in helping with that also.
Great. Thank you, Peggy. Very well said.
I have some thoughts just about how a review process might play out. Tracy and I have talked about the timing of launching a study, And I think after we get through the spring Federation meetings and into the summer, both in terms of her workload as well as an opportunity to hear from the federations ahead of a study would make sense. We're going to talk a little bit later in the agenda about spring Federation meeting attendance. And I think one of the things that we will share with all of the federations is this history, so that we can have a discussion at those Federation meetings about some of this historic context and talk to the federations about why we think a review is necessary and helpful. And if you all are able to attend a Federation meeting or two, I think it would be an opportunity for you to hear responses to some of the questions that Tracy has posed. And then we can use that information to help us shape a charge to the task force so that they really understand what kinds of review and deliverables we would expect back from them, including, for example, some possible legislative changes, if that's what the task force feels like might be in order. So I think this is a good opportunity for you as commissioners to attend those meetings with sort of your listening ears on, to start to gather some feedback and understanding that can help shape that study. This is going to be a long study, as Tracy has indicated. We would by no means be prepared to take any kind of legislative recommendations in the 2023 session. This would also have implications for administrative review rules, and that all requires public comment periods. So I think we're setting ourselves up for conversations ahead of a 2025 legislative session. And I think that's great. I think it's right to give us the right and appropriate amount of time to do this review well.
Okay, that sounds great. All right, thanks very much, Tracy. Really appreciate the presentation.